Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the fifth wave and Crash 1996. So, reasonably, this Crash is not the normal one that you would see every day. Because in a lot of ways, this is the James Spader movie that ultimately I will talk about. So, after I talk about the fifth wave. So, reasonably going into both of these movies, where can you see both of these films? The fifth wave, pretty easy. You can go on Tubi and watch this movie without a doubt. Really, Crash, I just ended up just kind of going on some app and watching it. You could probably go through Movie Pro or probably a Movie Play app or Movie Play box, and probably watch Crash 1996 because there's another Crash that ultimately a lot of people will talk about. I'm talking about the 1996 movie Crash, as long as I said that year correctly. So, going into this, I'm going to talk about the fifth wave. So, fifth wave movie about aliens, really talking about this at first in a non-spoiler like sense, and eventually go into spoilers. Really, this movie is to really just say, hey, don't trust anybody. Don't really tie yourself onto anyone because at any point anybody could be an alien. It's kind of like a invasion of the body snatchers, or reasonably. It was a very interesting movie that I saw, and then I rewatched it again tonight, and I'm like, you know what? Like this movie is it's okay. Like it quasi has a ballparkingly interestingly concept, but it's kind of has a goofy name that probably nobody understood what this movie was about. Maybe people probably thought it was some surfer movie or some tidal wave like movie, which it kind of is that, but then again, it's also mostly a movie about aliens. So, going into this movie, we have actresses like Chloe Grace, which ultimately I've seen in movies like Kick Ass, or I've seen her also in, oh gee golly, some other things as well. But I ultimately probably know her most from Kick Ass. I think she was in number 43, or no, movie 43. I think was she was also in that. Uh, yeah. Really pulling that one out of the gauntlets of ill contempt. But also, so was Liev Schreiber. Ultimately, was in movie 43. Ultimately, we have live Liev. It's probably live or it's leave. Um, Schreiber. I recently saw the show. I want to say it was like. I want to say it was like Donovan. Oh God, yeah. I think it was the show Donovan. I'm gonna have to look. Ray Donovan. Yeah, there we go. I started watching that show, but I never completed the season, so I never reviewed it. But eventually, I liked that show. It was a very interesting, like show to the stars kind of thing, where you have a guy that is kind of taking care of celebrities that do stupid stuff at some point, and I kind of like this series. But anyways, other than that, we also have Tony Revolori, who ultimately was in Spider-Man Homecoming as Flash or Eugene in Spider-Man Homecoming. So yeah, some pretty interesting cats, some interesting characters. There's also some other actors that probably people have seen in a number of freaking things. So let's go into talking about this movie. So this movie goes into the landscape of aliens trying to do certain things to basically destroy this earthly planet, creating all kinds of either weather things or causing just this world to be seemingly unlivable to try to kill off as many of Earth people or humans as they can. Ultimately, every single time when that fails to where the Earth isn't completely wiped out, then they eventually keep going and keep trying to figure out different ways and or waves of stuff to combat or come at the humans to kill them off. So I thought that this movie, the first time I ever watched it, I'm like, okay, like it's kind of hard to invest in everybody, but I guess if you have to invest in anybody, you have to invest in Cassie because you, like anybody you're expecting at any point in time, everybody's going to be dead or they're going to have like some ending where like you don't know who the others are, others meaning aliens. So when when watching this, and especially the first time watching it, because I think it kind of does feel like a one-off. If you've never seen it, uh, then you'll eventually get what I mean by it being a one-off. Or if you go and see it, then ultimately you'll be like, or ultimately if you have seen it before, you're like, yeah, I know what you mean. It does feel like a one-off kind of film. Like a lot of those kind of you would get a lot of those kind of like weather movies, or you'd get a lot of those like alien movies, or you would just kind of get those like you would just kind of get a lot of those movies where I guess every once in a while you can pop it in, but this one even more so feels like a one-off film because reasonably it has a hook to it, and then once you figure out that hook, or once you get to the point of that hook, then it's just like it's kind of like Ender's Game to me. It's kind of like that Harrison Ford film, Ender's Game. It's kind of like that where it's like, oh man, like so basically this doesn't have like a rewatchability, but you know what? I've watched it twice now, and yeah, it kind of at some points kind of feels a tiny bit like Divergent to me, like the first one, in some aspects where people are getting like pulled to be in a seemingly military-esque like force a little bit. So it kind of reminds me a tiny bit of Divergent. Not like uh, there's a little like a sliver of it, but still it's there. So, anyways, the fifth wave. Let's go and talk about this in very much spoiler-like terms because ultimately, if you learn anything about this movie or you figure out the hook of this movie, then it kind of just is really just explaining some things and this and that and here and there. So let's go into spoilers about this. Ultimately, you guys can otherwise check this out on Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service that at the end of the day, you could say that you had seen any number of movies for absolutely free. So I don't know how many freaking times I counted because I was like, I'm saying things while I'm counting, brr. And so recently, I think it's about that time for spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I get to spoil this movie. I'm trying to do something different with the spoiler time weird thing that I always do. Every I try to do a little funny things or whatever. But anyways, if you don't want to get spoiled for this movie, you can really fast forward to the point of me switching to the point of me talking about Crash, and then you can basically feel free to ultimately not hear one single iota of spoilers. For Crash, I would probably have to say probably go out of your way to go on Amazon and buy this movie. It should be reasonably cheap, or it should be just somewhere you could probably rent it maybe through Amazon's. or something. You would think like this movie, like, or just buy it. It's probably like, I'm sure it's probably not a thing that is. I don't think it would probably be full sale, but if it was, like, I think that this movie is visually weird enough to have people like. Crash is really just shock value. Crash is really just an absurd movie that I watched and enjoyed. So I'm not going to avoid talking about it. So let's talk about spoilers of the fifth wave. So, spoiler time. So, we mostly have in the very beginning of this, we have this montage and monologue or narration of Cassie talking about every single wave that has come through, other things that have happened, like earthquakes or tidal waves or all these kinds of things of which to try to otherwise kill every single person on this planet, pushing everybody to seemingly be in like these like forced living conditions where they're all like boot camped up, where it's just like everybody's having like a sleeping bed, and everything feels like they are just kind of uh, like they don't really have homes anymore. They're just really just kind of in an environment altogether, and really they're just like hoping that whatever the fifth wave will be will ultimately just not easily be an annihilation of sorts. So, in the very beginning of this movie, we have Cassie, who seems to be going off on a bus ride with her brother, but her brother ultimately is, of course, wanting his teddy bear. So ultimately, Cassie goes and runs for that. So while running for this bear, ultimately the bus drives off, leaving Cassie from her brother. So, reasonably, Cassie ends up going back to see her father. And what ends up happening is that the military comes in and starts talking to these people and really just mentions that he thinks that they're all aliens or that they're all infected. And so ultimately, it's time for them to all die. Cassie's hearing this, and she's basically realizing that she's going to have to watch her father die. Oliver, which is her father, which is Ron Levanstrom, Levanstrom, Livenstrom, Oliver. Man, these names are hard to pronounce in this review. I apologize. I'm going to butcher some people's names. I'll just go with Oliver to Sullivan. Or Silver? Okay, Oliver. Let's go with that one. That's easy. Ron. So, Oliver is looking and ultimately sees Cassie peeking her head out of a window, and Oliver's just telling her no. Like, don't come in here. Like, get back. Like, freaking hide. Like, no. Don't, like. So reasonably, Cassie has to hear the gunshots, hearing everyone that she knows probably, and her father die. Reasonably, she has to have a moment with her father, but then reasonably, she also has to eventually go on her own, eventually to where she ends up meanderingly being through the woods, and eventually ending up, of course, getting shot, of course. And we'll get to that. So now we have to figure out exactly what is going on with these kids being taken to these buses. Where these buses go. So what happens is that these kids end up being put into a military base where ultimately they get dog tags with numbers on them, and they have to wait to be, let's just say, seated. And so once they actually get waited upon, or once they have to wait long enough to eventually get seated, we have it to where there is, of course, usually seemingly one woman and one woman alone that administers this. I would call it kind of like a uh, like kill or be killed kind of moment. But anyways, so we have it in here where this colonel, who is ultimately played by Maria Bello, a sergeant. Thanks for giving me that softball there. I appreciate it. So Maria ultimately is a like very slick back military like force that is telling every single one of these kids that come in there that ultimately sitting in a sealed room next to them is an alien. Ultimately, we have a kid named Ben Parrish, who ultimately is Nick Robinson, that ultimately has seemingly lost everything and is basically, as a nickname, being called Zombie. Ultimately, he is shown that the a person that is hooked up to all of these mental devices and all these all these like brain-ish like plugs upon his head, and ultimately he's just standing there just brain dead seemingly. This sergeant is telling Ben that this thing is an alien. Ultimately, look into these glasses, these weird looking lenses that we have for you, and you could see that this is an alien. And then ultimately, like if he's not sure, the girl is telling him, look again, make sure that you're seeing what you're seeing. So we have it to where Ben ultimately continues to look within these. I would call them like like when you have to go to a doctor to get like glasses. They have to like, is it one? Is it two? Is it one? Is it two? Is it this? Is it that? And so on and so forth to where you can get like better vision. But like they don't keep adjusting the things. It just has like one lens like thing, like as if you're wearing, if you're gonna see like a 3D image or something when you look into this apparatus. So we have it to where Ben ultimately looks again into this and sees like a human brain, but it also has this like alien-esh like thing attached in front of it. So basically, because the sergeant is pushing him to kill this thing, and all he has to do is hit a button to do so, he hesitates, but then eventually the sergeant is telling him, come on, kill the alien, kill it. So ultimately he hits the button and kills the alien. Which I'm like, okay, one, why would they have one of these things alive? And two, how is it that this is going to be the only person? Like, do they have like millions of these things just laying around to ultimately to see if everyone pushes the button? Is that everyone's test ride? uh I don't know. I couldn't like it should have seemed then that they won the war already, and now like they're just doing this for fun just to kill aliens. That was kind of weird to me. But anyways, so we eventually have Zombie, who I'm gonna just call Zombie instead of Ben right now, going into the fold of this military base. And again, I'm gonna come back to Chloe's journey here in a second, because she has a very interesting thing going on. But I'm gonna transition at some point and get back to Chloe. So, or get back to Cassie, I mean. So we have Zombie who is put into the fold of this, and it's a very military operation. We have some people that are seemingly battle hardened, like the character Ringer that comes in, and all the other boys start staring at her butt, her rumpus room, her butts, her cheeks, and ultimately, I guess since all the guys are otherwise just like, yeah, we like definitely we can play some strip poker and all this. We can have a lot of fun here, Ringer. Um, I ultimately, when I heard I think the first time when I heard this, I thought they called her Winger, because I remember in the Bill Murray movie Stripes, Bill Murray's last name in that movie I think was Winger. So that's what I was like, oh, she's Winger. She's like Bill Murray from Stripes. Is that the little joke that they're pulling? But then I realize now, like the second time around, that it's like, oh, her name is Ringer. Oh, so she like she'll kill anybody and do whatever anybody wants because basically like she's battle hardened. So we have these we have these characters that are these military kids that are all told to go out and kill everyone, and ultimately if they all look like aliens, then go ahead and kill them all. Go ahead and just slay everyone, and everyone that you see that looks like an alien, go ahead. Don't like shoot first. Don't ask questions. So eventually they go out to ultimately start, of course, seeing. They go out ultimately to hide in a bus, and eventually they get to the aspect of seeing an alien or seeing a couple aliens, and immediately they're like, "Yeah, time to go kill some aliens." So recently they are trying their dangest to try to take these aliens down. But then while they're going about this, they're starting to realize that's like, why would the fifth wave be that they're gonna try to shoot us all down? Wouldn't they have like, man, they did so many extensive like things before. They did earthquakes and tidal waves and all this kinds of other stuff. Why is it that now they're gonna just go through and kill us one by one in a military like fashion? Isn't that kind of backwards? Isn't that kind of odd? So really, once people are coming to the consensus that like a lot of the kids are just like, well, keep shooting, keep trying to go after these guys. But again, people are starting to question things. It's like, isn't this kind of stupid? Isn't this kind of weird? Like, this makes no sense. So eventually it gets to the point to where we have it to where the one of the people are starting to really question everything, and I think that's really Winger at first, or Ringer. Now I'm going to call her Winger. Ringer. She starts to question everything at first, and then ultimately she takes the tracker out of her neck, which ultimately I don't think anybody really bleeds the first time that they take the tracker out, but I think when Cassie takes hers out, I think her tracker bleeds, and then ultimately when they have to take out the tracker for the kid, they don't show that part. I'm like, what? You couldn't show the kid taking the tracker out because that's too much for putting in a movie, I guess. Or reasonably, it's just like they may have thought that, oh, maybe an older kid taking, I don't know. But anyway, so we eventually have Ringer taking off her tracker device from out of her neck, and then everybody all of a sudden sees her as an alien. They're like, oh my god, she's an alien. And then Zombie is going to Ringer, and he's like, you know what, I trust Ringer. Like, I know she's not going to kill me, so I'm just going to get closer and closer to her and even hold a knife to her and see what she does. And Ringer doesn't fire at her. So he's like, okay, there's there's something fishy about this. So Ringer takes or Ringer. Zombie takes his tracker off, and then all of a sudden he is an alien, and they're like, "Oh my god, he's an alien! Oh my god!" And Zombie's like, "No, there's something wrong about this." It's like, if anything, like, I think this whole tracker thing is like an inhibitor, so that way you wouldn't shoot your own friends, but you would probably shoot everyone else who is. So anyone who is human is showing up as these aliens. And I think what is happening is every one of these kids were getting brainwashed because they didn't know any better, because they were very easy to manipulate compared to adults. That's why in the very beginning of this, all the adults were killed off and the kids were sent to this military like force. And I was like, oh my god, this is interesting at this point. So let's go back to, or wait, let's finish this up. So we have it to where Zombie is telling all the people, okay, here's what we do. Uh, you guys are all going to leave and take your trackers off, but I'm gonna go back to the military base to ultimately like get some questions answered, and so ultimately we have it to where Zombie puts back in, I guess, his tracker, and then ultimately he goes off to ultimately be shot by one of his own friends, so that way he could say that like all the people got him, but or everybody got all his friends but him. So he goes to the military base, and ultimately he is trying to find answers. So now let's go back to Cassie. Excuse me. I just sneezed there for a second. So Cassie is ending up getting shot at and falls under some car to be awoken in some house that she's not, of course, familiar with. We have it to where Cassie ultimately has had stitches in her leg, and ultimately just kind of not sure who she is at home with. Ultimately, she's maybe assuming that this person maybe tried to take care of her, so that way he could maybe take advantage of her at some point. And so, reasonably, Cassie is just kind of scrambling for her backpack or for any of her stuff, so that way she can make a getaway possibly. But while doing that, she tears all of her stitches out, and ultimately then just tries to pretend like she's asleep. We have Alex Rowe, who again, thanks again for that softball like name. Alex Rowe, who is Evan Walker, ultimately goes up to see Cassie and notices all full and well that she is awake. He's like, you can't get one over on him. Like, yeah, like, Cassie, I know you're awake. Hey. Ultimately, she asks, well, how do you know my name? Ultimately, Evan is like, well, I read, like, it's on your driver's license. I read your diary. I know everything about you because you've been asleep for a week. So might as well have just like kind of rummaged through all your stuff, because you were probably gonna end up dead anyways, right? And then also, what does it matter? Maybe I thought you were hot, and I just wanted to check you out. so so we end up finding out that Cassie ended up, of course, reopening up all of her stitches. Evan has to take care of her, and that's when she can really understand that this guy isn't out to kill her. He's out to protect her. So really, we just have it to where Cassie and Evan start doing a good old fashioned walkabout, or good old fashioned just walk in the woods somewhere until eventually they can get to something somewhere. And so during this time, you have these like campouts and whichever, what have you, to where it seems that more and more Cassie and Evan are really starting to connect because you gotta have a romance in this movie. So ultimately, at some point, we see Evan shirtless in a pond or like lake of sorts, and Cassie's just like, "Oh, I've never seen a half naked man before. That ultimately is very attractive, and we're all alone right now in the woods, so might as well maybe we can do something with this." But anyways, so eventually it seems that Evan notices that Cassie is maybe staring at him or stalking him, really. And so recently he doesn't say anything about it. He's just kind of like, hey, maybe she just wanted to, she just wanted to see something. That's okay. If anything, she can't easily like walk away from him that quickly, so he could probably hear her or see her or whatever walk away. Anyways, we ultimately have Evan that is making his way back to Cassie, and ultimately Cassie is looking at old photos, and we have it to where Evan is kind of mentioning all the stuff that he probably is familiar with Cassie because he read her diary. And so recently, Cassie is kind of showing pictures of some of her best friends or some of people that she knows in school. Ultimately, maybe Ben Parrish, who was at maybe some point going to be Cassie's girlfriend, she hoped, or Cassie's boyfriend, that she hoped would eventually be her prime squeeze, I guess. So we in this movie have seemingly this moment where now Ben is kind of really trying to make sure that like Cassie is. It's like, hey, don't bump your head and let me touch you on your head so that I can just have this sweet, nice little moment. Really showcasing that Evan just like, I know like I know that you like kind of like me, and besides, like we're the only one in these woods, so reasonably, we're the only people in these woods. Who else is she gonna find? Who else is she gonna find that's gonna treat her nicely? Nobody, no one, because everyone else is an alien, right? So we end up having it to where eventually Evan gives Cassie a gun, and then ultimately he tries to train her a little bit if anyone was to pull a gun on her, which I thought this was kind of a interesting moment, but I was like, okay, I don't like, are they just gonna have this moment so that way they can eventually show this somewhere in the movie, which I knew that that was gonna be a happening thing. So we eventually have it to where at some point some people, of course, through any kind of post-apocalyptic movie, you have these like hillbilly-ish like people, or just a bunch of people that eventually just want somebody's crap, want somebody's stuff. And so recently you just have a moment where people are going to attack people just because they have stuff and they want it. And so recently we have it to where Evan is eventually going and trying to defend himself and Cassie just because reasonably it's to the point now of like, well, Cassie is still kind of limping along, and reasonably like Evan needs to be the person to protect Cassie and do the nice thing, but also while doing that, Evan eventually showcases that he is a little bit stronger than you would honestly believe. Throwing some people, chucking some people, and so really with that, Cassie is just like, okay, who are you? Like, and kind of like holding a gun to Evan, just like, okay, like, what are you? Like, what were you trying to do with me? Were you trying to, like, get some intel? Like, what were you doing? So Evan eventually has to confess to Cassie. It seems like at first he was putting up a very much front to ultimately say that his parents were people who had a barn. Ultimately, he was heading to Kansas City State to go to college and this and that. And so, if anything, eventually Evan has to tell her that he's like, well, I am actually half human, half alien. I'm kind of a sleeper agent. But it seemed that when it seemed like consistently whenever I kept living here and being amongst all you people, like there was always a voice in my head talking to me and kind of telling me things. And so reasonably, like I am not one of the others, but I am also not exactly one of you either. So we have we have within here Evan confessing that he is technically like a half breed or a hybrid. And so recently how we crux this now is that eventually Cassie ends up getting to the point of being taken by a military force to eventually be put into being in being in where her brother is, because ultimately Cassie wants to get back her brother, because ultimately Cassie gives Evan a photo of her brother and he's like, oh well, like it'd be nice to meet him one day. So Evan knows exactly where the military place is to help Cassie get in there, so eventually she can sneak her brother out. And so luckily Cassie eventually easily gets a dog tag, and here's the real turning point, I guess you could say. We have it to where the same sergeant who had done the test on Zombie, ultimately we have very much Cassie go in here and doing the exact identical thing. Same person, same alien looking character that ultimately is told by Cassie that she needs to kill him. She needs to press the button. But Cassie is not really falling for this because she knows better. Ultimately, instead, taking out the sergeant, bashing her head against this thick glass, uh, bulletproof glass, knocking this girl out where there's lipstick residue, and then ultimately proceeding to try and get through this military base to ultimately find where her brother is. All while that's going on, we have Evan, who is eventually planting bombs within this environment. So while that is going on, we have Zombie who is talking to the Colonel, um, Colonel Vosh. Uh, Great names, Vosh. So eventually, Vosh is doing a debriefing of what happened to Zombie, uh, what all happened, and so reasonably, eventually, we get to the point where the Colonel is just like, you know what? Like, I don't think what you're really telling me is the truth. Like, I think you're telling me some bullshit. Like, so if you tell me the truth, I'll tell you the truth. So we get it to where Zombie is just kind of like, okay, well, how about I just like F it? Like he knows what I'm telling him is not the truth, so I'm going to tell him the real truth. So reasonably gets to the point of like Zombie knowing full well that Vach is basically an alien, and Vach is going to admit to that, and also so reasonably the fifth wave is actually our entire military force. Our entire military force is the fifth wave. They are all the people, like basically these people have all the control, and so that is what the fifth wave is, and they're manipulating kids, brainwashing them to kill off anyone, um, because they are humans themselves, to kill their own kind. And so that is the big hook in this movie. So they Zombie and Vach both tell themselves ultimately that, like, yeah, I know, here's my cards, here's yours. Like ultimately they have it to where Vach is mentioning that if anything, humans are just kind of in the way. That ultimately, that the aliens want what they want, and ultimately he realizes that this species uh, has killed itself or annihilated itself numerous times over. So if anything, this alien race is gonna just come in here to just finish the job that they ultimately uh, had already started. And so reasonably, like Zombie is kind of mentioning that it's like, well, hey, like we could have learned to coexist, and Vach's like, no, there's there's no way, there's no way that would be, there's no way to coexist. So we have the military coming in to ultimately tell us that all the planes are getting shipped out, and eventually everybody's taking off. And while that is going on, we have seemingly people getting ready to go. Ultimately, the colonel is going to tell the zombie that he is, of course, going to kill him, because reasonably anybody who finds anything out ultimately has to get killed. But instead, we seemingly have it to where Zombie is going to make his way uh, to get taken, I guess, to be killed, but instead Cassie ultimately makes her way there and bumps into Zombie, and then eventually eventually Evan ultimately also helps to take out any other kind of military forces that are kind of in their way. Um, and so Zombie is just kind of like, okay, who the heck is this person? And Cassie's like, well, he's with me. And so recently, Evan and Cassie have this like one last moment to ultimately they kiss one another, and ultimately he kind of at some points like basically tells her it's like, oh well, I've chosen you, I haven't chosen the others, and dot to dot dot dot. So Evan is mentioning that he is going to like put explosives all over this compound and take everyone out. So here's the mad dash to where now Cassie, as well as Zombie and anybody else that's kind of left on this rock. Ultimately, we have Vosh, who is ultimately seeing Cassie, Zombie, and Cassie's brother all running out, and eventually they try to shoot him down off the helicopter, but they're like, you know what, F it, let's just keep going. Because this headquarters is all just gonna just probably kill them off anyways. So eventually, the headquarters eventually just crumbles all down. We're just to assume that Evan is dead, is what we're left to assume. And ultimately, we have Ringer, who is now on some army Humvee and has all the other people with her. and picks Zombie, Cassie, and Cassie's brother up, and they drive off. So reasonably, that is just kind of how this movie just really just goes into ending. It doesn't really have like the best ending. It's just like, yeah, I guess happy ending, I guess, but realistically, it's just like it's a one-off movie, but that I've seen twice, which is stupid to say. But reasonably, it's a movie that really doesn't go enough to get anywhere, I guess is what I could probably say. And then once you find out what the hook is, you're just like, oh, okay, all right. Well, you're kind of like that through the rest of the film. So, anyways, let's go on to talk about the film called Crash. Let me pause here so ultimately I can get the cast set up already, so that way I won't stumble upon any names. So let's pause here. All right, Crash 1996. So reasonably, I will probably have to I will probably have to very much really cut through a lot of stuff within this review of me talking about this movie because there's a lot of adult content within this movie, a plethora of scenes. Roll to me, there is a lot of really just consistent, and I mean consistent, just shock value, uh, adult content. There is times when people are doing more than, let's just say, reading a good book in a bed together. So that is going to happen quite frequently in this movie. There is also a lot of times where uh, reasonably this just really focuses on car accidents. Really, we have a lot of people that are adrenaline junkies or just kind of looking for the next rung of of really just being people that need some more spice in their life. Because reasonably, there's only so many times that uh, you can get your rocks off by just going into the bedroom and getting down to it. It gets to a point where even in the very beginning of this movie, we have two people at seemingly a airplane hangar uh, going at it. It seems because ultimately we have it to where Catherine's character is ultimately just like, well, uh, she is doing this so that way she eventually can tell James, who is James Spader, uh, kind of uh, the thrill of it all, and so that ultimately, like them telling themselves these stories will get them eventually ramped up, so to speak, when they are both in of course doing some bedroom business together. So again, for most of this point, it's just like very little story, and then like okay, ton of bedroom ish like business. So going into this movie, I had probably heard about this movie a while ago, and I was just kind of like, yeah, but I'd probably never be able to find it or get to see it or whatever. And then finally, when I'm like, you know what, like, isn't there like some movies that ultimately I probably have been meaning to see and but haven't? And bizarrely, this is one that like just came up of me watching that popped into my brain because I think I was watching something with James Spader. I think I was probably maybe like thinking about Ultron or something at some point, and then that like made me think of James Spader, which made me think of of any movies that James Spader had been in. So yeah, that kind of like Inception or whatever you want to call it. Uh, just vice versa, maybe like, oh yeah, I never watched this movie called Crash, and who knows how anyone's gonna like any of this, but I'm gonna talk about portions of this movie anyways. So yeah, there's some interesting moments going on in this movie. There there's a lot of points where people putting their own lives on the line because again they are adrenaline junkies or they're thrill seekers, and it really just gets to the point to where enough just isn't enough, to the point of them um, hoping to finally get there, um, or if anything get to where uh, it gets them close, let's just say, to uh, any adrenaline junkies, thrill seekers, ba 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 ba. So interesting enough, we also have a little history, I guess, lesson also about James Dean in this movie, which I kind of thought was like fascinating. And but we also have at points in times when we have seemingly the character that plays Vaughn in this movie, which ultimately is played by Elias Koteas. I'm probably going to impronounce that because ultimately a lot of people probably know him from the first Ninja Turtles as Casey Jones, and ultimately a lot of people actually in this movie are kind of uh, very memorable actors that have, probably people have seen from any number of projects. Holly Hunter, who probably have people seen from probably Raising Arizona's or something along those lines. Uh, Rosanna Arquette, who plays Gabriel in this movie, I think I've kind of seen her in a number of projects. But anyways, so and of course James Spader, Age of Ultron, and the Secretary. But yeah, but this movie to me is very much like basically mention any movie that probably ties in the word sex, and there you go. Like movies like probably Stealing Candy, which has Cool J in it, which ultimately at some point I'd probably want to re-review and probably clean up that review because I could probably talk about that movie again. Probably any number of any films that I've probably at some point said, yeah, I can't probably review that again, would probably be a movie that would probably say, hey, that's what ties to this. Uh, Probably any movies that are like Nurse 3D, which ultimately I've seen that. Probably it's just called Nurse because I think you can't see it in 3D. You can't see that movie exactly in 3D at some points. But anyways, so yeah, let's get into the spoilers of this movie, and because recently it's probably really easy to review, because I have to do it cleanly. Because heaven forbid if you talk about anything, yeah, I could probably say certain words, but when looking at it, like you gotta tailor everything back for YouTube, because heaven forbid. But anyways, so in the very beginning of this film, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time to spoil this movie. So now I have to add little goofy little things to the spoiler times now and just kind of try to. Anyways, so in the very beginning of this film, we have two, of course, people who is James and Catherine that at the very beginning of this are trying to get caught doing an act of sorts. You know the act. Of course, we have Catherine who is at a who again is at a airport hangar bay thing. We have James who is at his office, um, ultimately, I guess, taking care of his secretary, let's just say. And it seems that one of his colleagues is calling him to ask him about a rewrite or asking him about some portion of his story that he has to take care of. So eventually he gets home with said wife, both people in bed talk about these stories and how reasonably like she had gone into this hangar and ultimately was quite possibly going to get caught, and James ultimately couldn't get to his business because reasonably uh, he was very much forced to finish his business, and no one um, came came into his office to otherwise be what are you doing? So recently, eventually, we have it to where it seems at some point that James gets into a car accident with seemingly Helen, who is actually Holly Hunter. And what ends up happening is that it seems like both of these people both eye one another, and then eventually they are at their respective cars, just eventually teasing one another, let's just say, uh, tossing it back, let's just say, of themselves, because I guess life is just short. I guess we really just have people that eventually just want an adrenaline rush, and eventually that's just what happens. Because what happens is James Spader ultimately sees a person out of Helen's car go flying out of it, and then reasonably it seems like both of these people like saw their life flash before their eyes. So if anything, they're just like, well, hey, we could probably just die in a couple of seconds. So how about we just give one good old shebang? So eventually, we get it to where seemingly this Helen and James ultimately gets off at these moments to ultimately just kind of consistently go to a place where there are car crashes. And so recently we have Vaughn's character, who is Elias, who is going and talking about a car crash that James Dean had been in, ultimately trying to recreate said car crash and colliding with another car on purpose to basically show a history lesson. It seems that this person has probably done this numerous times, to every time he tries to finish up this story, and eventually tries to crawl out of his own car to where it seems that people are going in to help him, and the police are being called because this was a planned car crash. And so recently we have both Vaughn and Vaughn's coworker, quasi coworker, being kind of rushed out of this environment, and so that way they don't get arrested. So eventually, we have Vaughn's character, who is seemingly has like a history of car crashes, and ultimately we consistently have it to where like this is what Vaughn does, is kind of the escalation of intimacy, I guess, at some point, when you would have like somebody like getting a thrill out of this. So it eventually they push the button just more and more, uh, to where ultimately you have Vaughn at some points like touching on people or grabbing people, and this and that, to where ultimately it seems that Catherine is interested in hearing about this Vaughn character, while James and her are sharing a bedroom together, and that's what ultimately pushes uh, James um, to ultimately drive around in a car while having Vaughn and Catherine in the back seat, eventually doing whatever they need to do, to ultimately assume that at some point they are probably going to get caught, and this and that, just kind of doing it right out in the public, going into a car wash, and everything along those sorts. So eventually we get it to where it seems that James and Catherine have this just easy, easy, just kind of understanding, to the point where even Helen and James at some point are just kind of like in their car, just kind of having a good time, let's just say, because at the end of the day, again, just like public outings, I guess, is just a really interesting thing for these people. So the more and more we just kind of push on within this movie, and again, there isn't much that I could go in and talk about, because yeah, it just eventually just fizzles out at some point within this movie, to where we eventually just have to say that adult content consistently, or there's some little tiny slivers of things that I could say. But anyways, we eventually get to where it seems like more and more these people are pushing this to the limit, to where it seems like purposely people are driving their cars wildly and not really like, and ultimately trying to get into an accident on purpose, seemingly. Or like, I think James's character ultimately, when he first gets into his car accident in this movie, we have it he uh to where he was just kind of like reading his papers and not really paying attention to the road. So, but in some point in this movie, also before we get to the very end, we have Gabriella, who we seem to find out uh, has these like metal braces, I believe, on her legs. To where ultimately we find out that she was in a car accident that ultimately left her with a scar upon her leg. Seemingly, James is taking any kind of thing that uh, looks like an opening of sorts, to try to otherwise see if he could like get any kind of uh, climb, no, get any love, any escalation of things, um, out of a something as simple as a giant scar on some woman's leg. And so reasonably we have positioning and trying to adjust this girl's legs, I mean, and eventually trying at some points to even try to buy a new car, and ultimately have it to where Gabriella is having issues trying to get into the vehicle, having it to where a guy is having a very difficult time getting this girl's leg back into this vehicle, and eventually having it to where uh, just kind of really uh, pressing the buttons of shock value to ultimately just kind of see, okay, how far can we push this, how far, like, will this person see anything, and this and that, can we get caught, dot. So eventually we get into where this movie eventually at some point ends, and we have it to where Catherine herself, the wife of James Spader, ultimately gets into a car accident, and James Spader's character James is ultimately rushing to her to ultimately ask, like, well, hey, did you have your moment? Did you have your time? And she's like, no, I didn't. But maybe next time, as basically he's basically like uh, pushing her while out right after having a car accident anyways. Because it gets to the point of how far can you push Catherine until it's too far consistently within this movie, and eventually to where this movie ends with them just right out in the middle of nowhere, just kind of going at it right after a car accident, and that's just how the movie just ends. So yeah, very. I had to very creatively try to try to snuffing out some of the stuff that I had mentioned within this movie. But you know what? If anything, like check out the movie if you can, buy it if you will, or just ultimately just find some other movies that eventually tie into this kind of stuff. Because yeah, I just wanted to just review this movie regardless, just to see if ultimately I could, let's just say, pull it off. Pull it off, because I'm like, you know what, like I eventually probably have to go into some movies anyways that ultimately I'm gonna have to figure out some convenient way of telling these stories without 100% going over everything. And so that's what this really review was, to see if ultimately if I could figure out a way to talk my way around certain scenes, or talk my way into figuring out how I can say this movie without actually, or talk about this movie without actually mentioning it. So that's all I had to have to say about Crash 1996. I don't really know how much I spent between that review and this one, but I saw both these movies and just thought I would talk about them. And so, yeah, I'm going to call this one a video. So I'm going to go. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.